Hi there, welcome to this month's practice clinic. This is Fitch speaking to you, and I am the co-founder of the Online Academy. And what happens is each month subscribers to the Online Academy send in their questions, practice related questions, but of course practice and technique and style, these all overlap. So it's a little bit woolly from that point of view, but the idea is that we talk about how we're practicing during the week. If we're piano students and we're having lessons, how do we make use of our practice time? How do we solve problems? So if you could perhaps, I've been given an invitation to share. Okay, great. So if you could perhaps just let me know where you're watching from and press all those nice buttons, the wow buttons, the like buttons, all of those things. I see Marco and Bordos are joining us, Steve, Michael and Lynn are watching. Welcome to you all. And actually Lynn, I think this was your question. The very first question we have is on Mozart K311, the first movement, bars 105 to 110, and Lynn asks for tips for playing faster and evenly, particularly hand positioning for the Alberti Bass and playing it fast. So how do we approach this? There's a few issues here. Mozart, of course, is extremely fiddly under the hands. It's not always well, it's always very exposed, put it that way. We can't bathe our sound in pedal like we can in romantic music, so we've got to be really, really precise. Belle says hello from Canada. Hello back. Great, so let's have a little look at the Alberti Bass. An Alberti Bass is simply this kind of thing. We get it all through the classical period. So the first thing to say about it is, well, there's several things to say about it. The first thing I would draw your attention to, the motions that I'm using are rotational movements from this direction. And we've got Bordos from Transylvania. Nice to see you, Bordos. So what do I mean by rotational movements? Rather than lifting the fingers up like this, do you see, that's one way of playing the piano, is just to lift the fingers and play that this way. Another way of manipulating the keyboard is to use movements where we swing in from the forearm. So if I exaggerate those movements for you for a moment, we wouldn't play with this amount of movement, but if you're struggling to feel the motion, do you see what I do there? Now, as I rotate from side to side, I'm making sure that my elbow is not dropping, and I'm making sure that my wrist is not moving, sagging. So we can practice exaggerating the movements at a slow tempo. Now, here we've got something interesting. I don't know if you could see what I was doing there. When I have my G chord in its root position, my thumb is assuming a position around here on my D. However, now I've got to move my thumb to the F sharp, and because the black note is higher up and further away, I need to make a movement upwards and inwards in order to comfortably get there. So how do I do that? Well, it happens just before the thumb is needed. You could probably notice there, when I go from my thumb to my fifth finger, do you see the movement? And now my thumb is comfortably in position for the F sharp, and then I would bring the position lower for the dominant seventh. Now the interesting, well, I wouldn't say interesting, but something we've got to watch out for, there's no way of joining, and I wouldn't say there's no way of joining, there's no need to join the G to the F sharp in the next bar. Certainly don't stretch the hand open. Don't try and do anything like that. You see what I did? I escaped from my keyboard. I jumped off the G, release, and then landed squarely into my fourth finger. So what you could do, just to sense that, it's very important that the thumb be quite firm there. If the thumb isn't firm, I've got nothing to jump from. If you imagine that you're jumping off of a spongy surface like, I don't know, a dry sand, if you're trying to jump off dry sand, you're not going to get very far. But if you've got something rubbery or firmer under your feet, then you can use that to propel yourself upwards. Same with the keyboard. See what I'm doing there? And if you want a little bit of target practice, practice where I overshoot deliberately, chromatically. Michael says he has to go and teach. I will watch the playback later. Watching your videos brings back so many memories. Nice to see you, Michael. So did you see how I got from the A7 back to the home chord? So another thing, Lynn, I think is important with this is rhythmic articulation of the bass line. So you could certainly practice at your tempo with just the bass, the notes that come on each crotchet beat or each quarter beat. I would also recommend this. You can hear the intensity levels. I think you can probably hear that this is the most relaxed chord. It's climbing, and here the greatest intensity. So you want to shape your left hand in terms of its intensity levels. You could play against the right hand. Whoops. I have to think. That would be a useful thing to practice. But whenever you want to get something from a slow tempo to a fast tempo, there's a kind of principle involved in this. You could either do it with the incremental metronome approach, which is, I guess, a kind of old-fashioned approach to doing it. It's certainly very solid, where you find the tempo that you can manage comfortably, and then play against that tempo. Let's say it's this. Etc. And then notch the metronome up by an imperceptibly small number. It could be 2 beats per minute, it could be 5 beats per minute, so that when you repeat it at that slightly faster tempo, it hardly feels any different, but it will be faster. And if you do that incrementally, what will happen at the end of your practice session, you'll have got up to a faster tempo. Then you can begin that process tomorrow. Let's say you can only get up to there. You start again from the beginning, and maybe the next day you can get a little bit beyond that. Now, I find that a bit laborious, to be honest with you. I prefer the little bits fast idea of chaining, which is to take, and this does take an awful lot of concentration. What you've got to do here is choose a little tiny snippet. It might be, and play that at the speed. But you've really got to use your feedback loop each time you stop. How was that? How did that feel? How did it sound? Were the notes together? Did it feel good in the body? And so you've got to really evaluate, so that when you repeat it, you're repeating it either to make a correction, to make it better, or you're repeating it to form a habit. So you might need to repeat it 2 or 3 times. I'm happy with that. Do you see what I did there? Concentrate before I play. And I'm aiming for the full speed, but I'm only doing a beat. And then, having arrived on the A there, I could do a whole beat if I felt like it, or again just work in small portions of the beat. There. Are those 2 fingers dead together? Now I've got this beat, and I've got this beat. I could see, now let's see if I can put those 2 beats together. You get the idea. That's a very, very good way of getting something from slow to fast. So I've given you now 2 different ways of getting something from a slow tempo to a fast tempo. The movements are really important. If we're using, let's say we practice another old school method, which is practicing in rhythms. Nothing wrong with old school method. I'm not saying that it's anything wrong with it, but it's not going to solve the problem. If you're using faulty movements, practicing in dotted rhythms and all the other things, other rhythms that we can do, won't necessarily solve if we're not moving correctly. Does that make sense? So of course I can use my rhythms. A rhythm I particularly like doing is taking a bunch of notes at the speed and then another bunch of notes at half that speed. So let's say I play my first beat. Let's do that the other way round. That's very engaging. I really have to think about what I'm doing, and then maybe the next time I do half the bar fast. And then half the bar slowly. Another thing that you could try is just to speed up the tips of the fingers there by just practicing staccato. Really sensing the finger tips. Just the very tip of the finger is extremely active in the staccato practice. So those are a few ideas. I hope they help you, Lynn. Moving to the next question from Vidya. Vidya is learning Clara Schumann's Nocturne, Opus 6 number 2, and would like tips on playing the left-hand rolls in measures 77 to 79. Would like any advice on practicing them properly to keep with the melody and dynamics in the right hand. Yeah, now, this was a piece that I actually wasn't overly familiar with. So I guess the tempo is somewhat like this. Something along those lines, and the rolls that Vidya is talking about are these, which are a bit of a handful. So the first thing I would suggest doing would be to practice without the thumb. Just let the thumb hang and just play the lowest 3 notes. Just making sure that that thumb is very freely hanging, because what we're going to do is to pivot across. So we need the low elements of the chord need to be very stable first before we can pivot across, because we've got to almost throw the arm. You see how I'm doing that? It's a very free throwing movement, and I'm using for me I feel the pivots from my second and third fingers. So you could even do this. Second and fourth fingers here. Back to the second and third. Second and fourth. And just swing back and forth between the thumb and the pinky, using these fingers as pivots. You can swing back and forth as many times as you want. That's one thought. You might find that you feel the pivot more from the second note up from the bottom, in which case, what is it, 3, 4. You might try it also from the second finger. I would next, or additionally rather than next, it's not necessarily a process of you do this first and you do this second. These are just a few ideas that came to me as I was exploring this passage. Start off by bass by itself and then add. That's a very useful thing to practice, because I can really sense 3 and 5, 4 and 5, 3 and 5, 4 and 5. I can do the same thing from the top. The top 2 notes. What if I played the bottom 3 notes? I think we started with that, didn't we? Let me do the same with the top 3 notes. So these are just useful ways to practice routinely, to keep that motion very, very comfortable. Now, when it comes to putting it together, I did have a little bit of a think about this. And I considered the idea, if you're struggling with them, you could put the crotchet or the quarter note chord on the beat, and the quaver or the 8th note chord before the beat, which buys you quite a bit of time, because there's not as much hurry. I was going to do that, wasn't I? Let me do that in super slow motion, in ultra slow motion. It would be this. could put them all before the beat if you want. No, that's before. I was going to do them before, wasn't I? So you could explore those ideas, Vidya, and see which way of organising the spreads is easier for you. But yes, the trick is not to hang on to the bass, to the bottom note, but do hang on to the middle notes, or a middle note, whichever one feels more comfortable for you. John is asking about practice techniques that could help refine my touch as I work on Brahms' Ballade, Opus 10 No. 2, specifically the section from bar 51. Now let me just find that. Yeah, now this is Brahms being difficult. Brahms, oh, there's video right there. What we've got here is a texture with a long note in the middle and a bass line underneath. And then on the top of that we've got acciaccatoras. What is this? That's a nasty one. So we've got there, first of all, to hear the lines. I think it's very important that the acciaccatoras are not just creating chicken sounds in the background. It's not pop pop kind of sounds. So if you respect the acciaccatura, I can't even say the word acciaccatura as a line in its own right, and respect this as a line. So in your practice, you might just, because the problem with staccato notes, when we've got staccato notes, we tend not to connect in our ear one to the next, and they all end up sounding like little detonations that don't relate one to the next. So what you could do, Frankie is coming from Indonesia. Hi, Frankie. And then we've got Zlatka and Rachel, who don't say where they're watching from. But you see, the first thing you could do would be just to connect the line in the bass. See, that already, by doing that, my attention is drawn to the contours of the line. 4 notes that go up, 5 notes that go up, and then a descent. And now, again, notes that go up, but there's a chromatic colour here. A little bit more intensity in that line. And then zigzags, bigger steps, so that when I play staccato, do you hear what I'm doing there? I'm able to create shape in the line, contours in the line, from having heard the line staccato. Legato first, I mean. Now let me look at the top line. This is probably what we'll end up hearing. I'm hearing it as a melodic line. Now, what about the acciaccatoras? They're so small I can hardly see them. But their smallness should not belie their significance as a kind of middle line. What does the acciaccatura line sound like with the bass? Whoa, nice. And surprising. No. So I think to keep our ear really focused on linear, horizontal lines rather than, vertical events is very helpful. And then when we put that together, I'm going to show you some ideas for practice in a second, further ideas for practice in a second, but when I put that together, I'm doing it slowly for you, and also for me. What I'm listening for is the B, there should be enough thumb. Do you hear that? So that the thumb rings through, and it's the thumb that joins those staccato lines together and makes the sound actually sound. If you don't give enough thumb there, the sound is nothing. It sounds like a bunch of notes. So quite a bit of that. Do you hear that? That B is ringing, and I've got to make it last for 3.5 bars there. So just further practice ideas, you'd really want to be very sensitized to the tip of the finger. It's rather like I was talking about earlier with the Mozart and Lynn's example. The tip of the finger it needs to be engaged. It's almost like a pizzicato effect. Not too short though, you don't want it too dry, too short, because there needs to be a little bit of resonance. So maybe imagine a pizzicato with a vibrato or something like that. I'm not a string player, but that kind of idea. Really close to the key. I think that's probably what I'd advise first, is play the staccato from the tip of the, from the surface of the key with the tip of the finger. Don't land on it from above, but pluck it. Now, speaking of plucking movements, we want in the right hand, to avoid tension, and this is a kind of tension trap, we want to make sure that when we're practicing, we release that pizzicato and close the hand up. See, when I make that, that's a kind of effortful movement, effortful. So I want them to close the hand up. And you may say, well, how can you do that at this speed? Well, I'm doing it now. So what I'm feeling is that, yes, okay, the hand doesn't completely close up in between each burst of energy, but the intention is there just to loosen the hand so that you don't keep it locked. That would be fatal. If I kept my hand locked, it would be absolutely fatal. So for practice, close. And can you see the hand is again plucking from the surface of the keys. Now to get it faster, I like working in groups fast, maybe groups of 2. Right, and then perhaps next in groups of 3. Let me just concentrate. That kind of idea. Yeah. Do you see what I'm doing there? So it's at my tempo, but I'm putting in. I call these controlled stops rather than accidental stops. So I practice with controlled stops of different lengths, so that I don't embed a stop anywhere for any length of time. I'm always changing where I put the stops. So I think, John, that would help you. I hope that would help you. Moving to the last question, we've got fewer questions this month than normal. And this is from Beatrice, who says the following. Your practice tips for Billy Mayall's Marigold last month made me want to revisit this piece. And actually I heard that from a couple of people. They were remembering, oh yeah, I used to play Marigold. I'm struggling a bit with the opening from bar 4. Not sure if it's my right hand fingering or the left hand jumps that put me off, but I'm finding sometimes it works okay, other times it's messy. Can you help, please? I think philosophically this is an important thing. What we're doing in the practice philosophically is important, because a lot of the time people just will play over and over and over and over, hoping that you know, at the end of a practice session that they'll get it better. And usually what happens is it might even be significantly better at the end of a practice session, where you've kind of got onto a roll and you've got into the flow, and at the end it's improved. But then the next time you come to it, it may be, you may think, well, that's really disappointing. I had this yesterday, I don't have it today. And I'm often remembering the story of the 3 little pigs, you know, the first little pig who built his house from, I always forget what it was, but it was some flimsy material, and the big bad wolf comes along and blows it down with one huff and a puff. And then the next little pig builds his house out of slightly stronger material, but it still goes down with the huff and the puff. The third little pig digs a really solid foundation. He takes the time to dig down into the foundations, into the ground, before he builds up, and then he builds with bricks. So what would be the equivalent of that in piano practice? Well, I think the opposite of just playing it through, hoping it will get better. It's not a very good way of making progress. And it's actually frustrating. Sometimes people tell me, well, your ideas are all well and good, but they take a lot of concentration and they do take a bit of time. And I'm thinking, yeah, anything that you want to do well requires focus and concentration. So if you're playing for pleasure, and we're all playing for pleasure, we all love music, you'd still want to get the best result, wouldn't you? You wouldn't want it to be good on a Monday and rubbish on a Tuesday, or sort of acceptable on a Wednesday, but really no idea what you're doing on a Thursday kind of thing. So really what I'm suggesting is the third little pig's approach would be to start with, perhaps take the left hand by itself and do some quick covers. Do you see how I'm measuring these distances? No, I didn't like that because my second finger was not over the E flat. That's better. No, my second finger again. And if I should find it, it's my second finger that's letting me down. I can take that finger first and then let the rest of the chord drop in afterwards. I could extend that to whatever notes are in the middle. There it's just one note. There it's two notes. That's great. My inner third little pig is extremely happy with this. I'm actually really enjoying this process. And then how about if I go to the thumb? Oh, that feels great. And now to the bottom note. I'll do that again. And then what I could do next with my left hand would be, this is a process I call springboarding, or acciaccatura practice. I use this as a springboard for this. And then I use this as a springboard for this. So each one is a springboard for the next chord. And then, just like I was showing in the Mozart example, some chaining. Can I chain from here to there? Can I chain from there to there? And then from here to that bass note. So each time I'm playing three chords, but I'm backing up a chord. Now this. Maybe I can then graduate to 4 chords in one impulse. And then what I really should have done, could have done, would be to move, but cover that F before I left that, just like I would here as well. So we don't just do that once, we do that regularly in our practice until we automated those. And I find that the process of practicing like that is hugely enjoyable. It's not just gives good results in the end. I say in the end because it does take a little bit of an investment before you get the results, but the process of practicing like this I find really satisfying. The right hand, well, I think the first thing is Beatrice asks, or makes a comment about not sure if it's the right hand fingering. You do have to have a good fingering. I start with 3-1, move to a 2 here, 2-1, then 3-1. When I say I start, I don't actually play this piece, but I'm considering learning it because it's actually great. And then 5-3 here, 4-2. This is the fingering I quickly found. So if this fingering doesn't work for you, by all means find another. 5-2, 4-1, 3-2, 4-1, 5-2. It's just a kind of palindrome there. Now that fits my hand, that 3-2. If it doesn't fit your hand, just use a 1. And then release. Now, whenever we've got double notes, we can draw a principle out of this. Think of them as 2 separate voices rather than just a clump in the hand. So, you know, and there's nothing to stop you. Whoops. Quite a bit of concentration because I'm inhibiting my thumb notes. I'm not playing my lower notes, and I'm playing that against the left hand. I could do that much better. That's better. would do the same job with the lower notes. Thumb, thumb. Now that sounds weird as a line, but it's a really useful thing to hear it as a line. Yeah, that's really challenging me because my ear is not used to that, but it's actually what my lower part of my right hand is engaged in. So having extracted each line by itself, putting it together, you can do a little double tap of the top note, of the top finger. That's very useful. And then the reverse, do a double tap of the lower note. And I took that a step further when I was looking at this yesterday. I thought, what would it feel like if I extended the number of taps to fit in with the metrics of the piece? Now, we've got a swing rhythm here. These are not actually dotted quavers, semiquavers, dotted eighths, sixteenths. They end up being triplets. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Yeah, right, triplets, a swing. He's written them as dotteds, but they're not dotteds actually. So you would have, if you followed that tapping idea, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the other way round. With the bottom note. Yes. Very good for the independence between the two parts, and actually rather like an exercise that Alfred Cortot might have dreamt up had he been editing this piece. It's similar kind of things to the exercises, to the best of the exercises we find in his study guides, study editions. So then if I wanted to do a fantastic job putting that together in that way, I could make a decision to move my left hand at a very precise 2, 3, 4 on the third tap. Do you see how I'm covering? Move. Then the other way round. So it's slow practice, but the movements are super fast. And super accurate. I wouldn't go on if they weren't accurate. That would be a neat way to practice. It would be one way to practice. And then you'd want to get on to the chaining ideas again. Hands together. Make sure that's really comfortable before you add. And then you could start from here. Let me see if I can do that better. That's better. I'll learn this one day and surprise you by playing it in one of my Pianist Magazine videos, the introduction music. It's a stunning little piece, this. It's great. It's really good value. So you'll notice there that the steps that I was taking in the practicing were not just hammering away at it until it got better. They were foundational stages, practice stages. So there's Joe. This is so useful. Thank you, Graham. How often do you run these sessions? Oh, Joe, yeah, nice to see you. We do these once a month, and usually on what day is it today? Wednesday at noon. So if you look on join the mailing list. If you're not already on my mailing list, you can get that from the practicingthepiano.com. Join the mailing list, and you'll hear all about these. And then you can send in your questions, and I can have a look at the various things here. So slow practice is always difficult, says Chia. Slow practice is difficult because it requires quite a lot of focus, and it's only useful to a certain point. You won't get something from slow to fast without secondary stage. So you'll notice that the secondary stage I prefer is the chaining idea, the little bits fast. So I think it's time for me to leave, and I'm going to say goodbye to you now, and thank you all very much for your attention and for your questions, and I'll look forward to seeing you next month.